So hello, welcome back to the last topic of the subject human resource development, which is HRD matrix. A simple and small topic. Let's get into the class. So before directly entering into today's class, let us understand certain basics relating to this topic, HRD matrix. So basically what is HRD matrix? HRD matrix is a tool which is developed by Mr. T.V. Rao, the father of Indian HRD. Okay. So basically this particular HRD matrix is a tool which gives interrelationships between four different components which are related to HRD. Now what are these four different components? We have the first component has the HRD mechanisms or subsystems or interventions that we have already discussed. We have the second component called HRD processes. We have this third component called as HRD outcomes, and we have this fourth component called as organizations effectiveness, or basically the impacts or the outcomes relating to organizations effectiveness or efficiency also. So basically, see, let us understand about each of these components. See, HRD mechanisms or interventions that we have already discussed, right? All the tools and techniques or mechanisms or interventions or subsystems that the organization uses in order to develop its human resource, those are basically considered as HRD mechanisms or interventions or subsystems. Now, what are these? What is the second component of HRD processes? What do we mean by HRD processes? See, for example, if we are using counseling, okay, counseling is one of the HRD mechanism, right? Now, if we are using, this is an example, if we are using counseling in order to improve the employee's performance, now we can, we can do that through so many different things, through so many different things. Counseling increasing the employee's performance through so many different things. These so many different things which acts as a bridge between this component and this component are generally termed as HRD processes. Like for example, now I can use counseling in order to increase the employee's performance using performance planning, using role clarity, using generating a good octopus pyramid in an organization, using improving his perception on the values beliefs, or basically improvising the values beliefs in the organization, improvising the rules regulations norms and all those things in the organization. So I am using this component in order to get this component through this, or I am using counseling in order to improve the employee's performance through providing him with role clarity, or different things like improving my organization's culture, or by planning his performance and all these things, right? These through things, the middle component is generally termed as HRD processes. So coming back to the topic, HRD matrix gives interrelationship between HRD mechanisms or interventions or subsystems, that is the first one, and we have HRD processes, that is the second component. We have HRD outcomes, that is the third component, and all the outcomes on the organization's efficiency or effectiveness, that means improvised organization's production or improvised organizational performance and all these things. So the relationship is being given between these four components using HRD matrix. Now let us go to the theory part, and I will be showing you a small diagrammatic representation of all these four different components, and we will see how this particular HRD matrix gives relationship, or basically how this HRD matrix gives the linkage, or basically the link, the chain between these four components. Then at last we will be moving to the theory part, which is just for your reference. Now let's look at that diagrammatic representation. So basically 10th unit HRD matrix. Okay, Professor T.V. Rao has developed a model which explains the interrelationship between human resource development instruments, that is the mechanisms or interventions, the processes, HRD processes, the outcomes, the HRD outcomes, and the organizational effectiveness known as HRD matrix. This is basically the meaning of this particular HRD matrix. Now let's look at the diagrammatic representation. See, we have what we just discussed, telling that HRD matrix gives relation, right? Now how does this particular HRD matrix gives the relationship between these four components? So this is the first component, mechanisms or interventions. This is the second component, HRD processes. Now this is the third component, HRD outcomes or outcomes and variables. Now this is the fourth component, which is organizational effectiveness, right? Now see, these are all the HRD mechanisms or subsystems or interventions that we have discussed in the previous classes, right? So in an organization, these are the things that are used by the organization in order to develop the human resource, right? Okay, you understood, you accepted that, right? Now I told you what do we mean by HRD processes, right? These are the these are some of the HRD processes, and the HRD outcomes that are basically the end results of the HRD mechanisms using through certain processes and all. You will be getting certain HRD outcomes like these things, like more competent employees, like better developed roles, like increased work commitment, increased job involvement, better problem solving, better utilization of HR, increase job satisfaction, increase motivation. In this way you will be having so many different HRD outcomes by using certain mechanisms through certain processes, right? Now by using all these things you will be having certain impact on the organizational effectiveness or efficiency, right? Like you may have increased productivity, or you may have increased profits, or you may have cost reduction, or you may have growth, etc., right? So the interrelationship between all these four components is generally given by HRD matrix. Now for example, let us assume that we are using counseling as a HRD mechanism. Now let us see how this model gives the linkage. Now if I am using counseling as as a mechanism, or as an intervention, or as a subsystem in my organization in order to develop my human resource. Now if my outcome, or my objective, or my goal is to increase job involvement, okay, now I can tell that I can do that by using performance planning, right? Or you can tell that usage of these HRD mechanisms in an organization will result in certain HRD processes, which will in turn have certain HRD outcomes, which further will have an impact on the organizational effectiveness or efficiency, right? Now you can actually tell this way, or you can just take a simple example telling that, see, by using certain things like certain mechanisms like potential appraiser, I can generate something called as increased communication, which will further help me in better utilization of human resource, which will further have an impact on the organizational effectiveness in terms of profits, or in terms of cost reduction, or in terms of increased productivity and all. So basically this particular HRD matrix gives the interrelationship between these four components, telling that if you use this if if when you use HRD mechanisms or interventions or these particular things, these particular processes will be as a result product. Now this particular result product will in turn generate certain outcomes relating to human resource. Now these particular outcomes generated in relation with the human resource in an organization will further have an impact, or will further result in these particular things which are related to organizational effectiveness or efficiency. So basically these are the four components between which the relationship, or the linkage, or the chain relationship is given by this particular tool of HRD matrix. So this is basically why HRD matrix is being used in organizations, or basically why HRD matrix is used in organizations. HRD matrix basically gives the relationship between these four components in organizations. So organizations use this tool in order to create a chain of linkage between these particular different outcomes relating to the human resource development in an organization. Now see, now let's talk about certain things, telling that, see, we just talked telling that by using human resource development mechanisms or interventions or subsystems, we are actually forming, or we are actually creating a path for certain HRD processes like role clarity, performance planning, octopies, right? Now you can't tell that in each and every situation, or every time I use a HRD mechanism, a HRD process will definitely be formed. This also has an impact by certain other variables like personal policies, management styles, top management's commitment, investment of HRD, etc. What do I mean by telling this is, see, for example, if I use a mechanism called as rewards in my organization, okay, if I use an intervention or HRD subsystem in order to develop the HR human resource in my organization through rewards, if I use rewards as a tool, now I can't tell that since I use rewards, definitely HRD process will be as an outcome. That means since I use rewards as a mechanism tool in my organization, definitely I'll be having certain processes like role clarity or performance planning and all these things. You can't tell. It also depends on certain other variables like personal policies, management styles, top management's commitment, investment of HRD, etc. That means in simple terms, if the personal policies, or management style, or top management's commitment, or investment of HRD, etc., if these kinds of variables are negative in your organization, for example, if the top management does not have any commitment towards the development of human resource in an organization, if okay, then even though you use you use all these HRD mechanisms, you may not be having your expected outcomes, because there are certain other variables which also have an impact on these particular things. Similarly, there is this fourth component, right? Organizational effectiveness or organizational efficiency. You will also be having certain variables which will have an impact there also. That means you can't always tell that, see, I have used all the HRD mechanisms or tools, techniques, or basically interventions in my organization in a very strategic or a very perfect way without any mistake, and by using these things certain HRD processes came out, and since these HRD processes came out, they, because of these HRD processes certain HRD outcomes came out. Now since HRD outcomes are good, I will always have a positive impact on my organizational efficiency or effectiveness. I can't generally tell that. I can't tell that in all situations. That means even though there will be certain situations in which even though you have used all your HRD mechanisms in a very efficient, effective way, and even though you have got a very positive, a positive outlook towards the HRD processes, and even though that in turn created a very positive HRD outcomes, or basically that created a very good impact on the employee's performance or whatever it is, the HRD outcomes, you can't always tell that, because everything is going, in a good way, I will have a positive impact on my organization. You can't always tell that, because there are certain other variables which have an impact on your organizational effectiveness or efficiency. Like, see, you will be having environment, right? You will be having technology, you will be having market, and all these, variables which will be having impact on your organizational effectiveness, right? Now, for example, you have used all these HRD mechanisms or subsystems or interventions in your organization for the development of HR, human resource in your organization. Now, by using all these things, HRD processes came out. And because of these HRD process, you have so many different positive impacts on your human resource in your organization. Like, see, by using these HRD mechanisms, your employees become more competent, their roles are better developed, their work commitment is increased, their job involvement is increased, their job satisfaction is increased. In this way, so many different things happen, right? Now suddenly there is a technological change, suddenly there is a change in the environment, suddenly there is a change in the market. In that scenario, even though everything related to the previous three components went according to the plan or went according to the expectations, you may have a negative impact on your organization's effectiveness or efficiency. So there are certain variables which have an impact on the HRD processes and the organizational effectiveness or efficiency, even though each and every other components are in sync or in line or are going in a perfect way. Okay. Now this is the basic concept of HRD matrix. So basically HRD matrix is a tool which is given by Mr. T.V. Rao, which basically gives you the linkage between HRD mechanisms or interventions or subsystems and HRD processes and HRD outcomes and the organizational effectiveness or efficiency. Basically this particular tool called as HRD matrix tells that, see, by using mechanisms there will be so many different processes, and in turn there will be so many different HRD outcomes, and in turn there will be so many different organizational effectiveness or efficiency outcomes. Or in other way, telling all these things in other way, you can tell that, see, by using certain HRD mechanisms, you can get so many different outcomes by using certain HRD processes, and by using all these three components you can have certain impact on the organization's effectiveness or efficiency. In this way, you can actually create a link between all these mechanisms, all these processes, all these HRD outcomes, all these outcomes relating to organizational efficiency or effectiveness through this tool called as HRD matrix. Now again giving you a simple example relating to this diagram. If you still have any confusion, I can tell that, see, I'm just trying to give you a different way in which you can use this model, or a different way in which you can find a linkage between these components using this model. Like for example, see, if I want to use a mechanism called as training, okay, in my organization, if I want to use an intervention called as training, and if I want to have an outcome of increased job satisfaction among my employees, now I can use certain HRD, this model. Using this model I can tell that, see, my aim is getting increased job satisfaction, and the tool or mechanism that I am willing to use is training, or I have chosen to use is training. Now I can concentrate on different HRD processes in order to get to my objective. That means I can tell that, see, I'm using training as a tool and my objective is increased job satisfaction among employees. Now I can use so many different things, like I can actually try to use the process of role clarity, or I can use by implementing this training I can focus on providing more role clarity, so that in turn I could reach my objective of increased job satisfaction. In this way also you can look at this model. That means By using this model, you can actually form relations, different chains of relations between these four components of HRD interventions or mechanisms, the HRD processes, the HRD outcomes, and the organizational effectiveness or efficiency related outcomes. This is basically the purpose, or this is basically the meaning of this term or meaning of this tool, or the basic function of this tool, HRD matrix. I also told you that there are certain other variables that we also have to consider, which will have an impact on these components of HRD processes and organizational effectiveness or organizational efficiency. Now let's get into the theory part, which you can take it as a reference for whatever we have discussed till now. Okay, now let's move to the theory part. So coming back to the theory part, what is HRD matrix? We have just discussed. Now HRD matrix identifies the interrelationships between HRD instruments, that is mechanisms or interventions, the HRD processes, the outcomes, HRD outcomes, and the organizational effectiveness. So basically we just discussed till now telling that HRD matrix is a tool which gives interrelationships, or basically the chain of linkage or the link between these four components. Now let's look at each and every component in detail. Same thing that we have just discussed, just for a reference, this theory part. See, HRD mechanism or subsystems or instruments, the first component. These include performance appraisal, counseling, role analysis, potential development, training, communication policies, job rotations, rewards, job enrichment programs, etc. These are basically, we are basically listing out all the, not all, but most of the HRD mechanisms or interventions or subsystems. Okay. Now, these mechanisms may vary depending upon the size of the organization. That's true, right? The commitment of the top management, yes, the environment, the culture, the climate, and the perception of the people, technology used, methods employed by the competitors, etc. So basically, we are telling that the first component relates to entirely HRD mechanisms or interventions or subsystems. Now, moving on to the second component, which is HRD processes. Now, the second component, HRD processes and climate variables, and also we also talked that there are certain variables that we have to keep in mind, right? So the HRD instruments lead to the generation of HRD process like role clarity, performance planning, developmental climate, risk taking, dynamism in employees, etc. So basically we are telling that by using all these HRD mechanisms, you are basically generating certain HRD processes. Like in this way we have discussed these things. Now such HRD processes should result in more competent, satisfied, and dynamic people. Okay. Now from here it is a typo. Okay. Typing mistake. This point is not there. So such HRD process should result in more competent, satisfied, and dynamic people. So here we are basically talking about the HRD outcomes. Okay. Such HRD outcomes influence the organizational effectiveness in the long run. Okay. Now it may be noted that organizational effectiveness also depends on the number of other variables like environment, technology, competitors, etc. So here we are basically telling that the same thing that we have explained. We are telling that HRD process, this particular HRD process is there, right? These particular HRD process are the outcomes of HRD mechanisms. That means by using the HRD mechanisms or interventions or subsystems in an organization, we are basically generating certain HRD process, or basically by using all those things, there are certain resultant products, or there are certain outcomes like HRD processes, or basically the outcomes of those things are HRD processes. Okay. Now here we are also telling that, see, there are certain variables that have an impact on this HRD process. Similarly, when we go to the fourth component, there are also certain other variables which have an impact on them also. So there are so many typing mistakes in this point, so I'm sorry, but the explanation is same. Now the third component is HRD outcomes or variables. We have also discussed HRD instruments and processes make people more committed and satisfied, where they tend to give their best to the organization enthusiastically. Now, the fourth component, organizational effectiveness. The HRD outcomes influence the organizational effectiveness, which in turn depends on a number of variables like environment, technology, competitors, etc. So, the basic thing that we are trying to understand from today's class, which is HRD matrix, is HRD matrix is basically a tool given by Mr. T.V. Rao, which gives you the interrelationship between four different components in an organization relating to HRD. That means this particular tool tells that by using the first component, you are generating the second component. And by using the first component and second component, there are certain resultant products called as the third components. and by using all these components you are resulting in certain components which are fourth components. So basically this particular model of HRD matrix tells this, telling that by using the first component, which is HRD mechanisms or subsystems or interventions, there are certain processes which are generated which are called as HRD processes, and by the generation of this HRD process there are so many results that come out which are basically the HRD outcomes, or basically the impacts on the human resource in an organization. And by using all these things you are creating an impact on the human resource in an organization, right? That will further have an impact on the organizational effectiveness or efficiency. So this is basically the linkage given by this tool HRD matrix. Okay, so this is basically the concept of HRD matrix. Now this has been this entire subject of human resource development. See, we have from the beginning of this, from the beginning of this subject we have looked into so many different concepts. Like basically we started by the introduction to human resource development. What is human resource development? What are the different things related to human resource development? We talked there, we talked those things, right? And then we moved on to the next topic, telling that see, these particular human resource development in an organization things, they are basically carried out using certain systems and subsystems. Systems mean this thing, subsystems means these things. There are certain systems which concentrate on different criteria, and within each system we have certain subsystems. These subsystems are also called as interventions or mechanisms or tools and techniques that are used for developing human resource in an organization. We have discussed that in a separate unit. So basically we started by introduction, then we moved on to the HRD systems, and then we moved on to the HRD subsystems, and then we moved on to the training thing, where we talked that what do we mean by training, what is the basic purpose of training and all these things. And then we also told that see, this particular training follows a certain framework, or there is a certain fixed framework, fixed structure for this training thing, which has different components. So this particular framework of training has four different components or four different steps, which starts from training needs analysis. Then based on the training needs analysis outcomes, you develop a training program, then you implement that particular training program, and then you evaluate that particular program. And all these things we talked in training related part. So we started with introduction, systems, subsystems. We moved on to the training part, in which we looked after so many different things within the training part. And then we moved on to coaching, mentoring, counseling, right? And then we looked after different aspects relating to this coaching. We looked after different aspects related to counseling, mentoring, and all these things. And then we moved to an entire different thing called as HRD culture, HRD climate, and all these things, right? And then we moved back to career management, where we talked about different aspects relating to career, right? And then we finally reached to today's class, which is HRD matrix. So basically when we talk about fundamentals relating to human resource development, I think that these are enough. Okay, now this has been this subject. That means these are all the topics that that refer to the fundamentals relating to human resource development. Now from next class we will be starting the new subject, which is organizational behavior. Now this has been today's class, and this has been this subject. Thank you.